Gentlemen, thank you very much for attending the first lecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the 60th anniversary come the 35th Chen Wu Lecture in History and Culture of New Asia College. Today's lecture is jointly organized by the Department of Chinese Language and Literature and New Asia College. We're extremely honored to have invited Professor Martin Kern, Professor in Asian Studies, Princeton University, to give us a talk on rethinking authorship in early China. And we are also very delighted to have Professor Chan Nicholas Lewis, Department of Chinese Language and Literature of CUHK, to be the moderator of this lecture. So, without further delay, I will now pass over to Professor Chan to introduce the speaker and start the lecture today. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the lecture, the first lecture of our series this year. And we are very honored to invite Professor Martin Kern to be the speaker of the series. So let me give a brief introduction about Professor Kern. Professor Kern is the Joanna and Greg 84 P13 P18 Zilek Professor in Asian Studies, Princeton University. He also serves as co-editor of Tongbao, a member of the American Philosophical Society and the president of the American Oriental Society. At Princeton, Professor Kern directed the university-wide collaboration Comparative Antiquity, a Humanities Council global initiative. He also co-directs the Princeton Venice Summer School in Classical Chinese and Classical Japanese, Kanbun. And at Renmin University in Beijing, he directs the International Center for the Study of Ancient Text Cultures, a center committed to the global study of antiquity in comparative contexts. And the publications of Professor Kern are numerous, and they address topics across all genres of ancient Chinese literature, including poetry, as cultural memory, and as performance in political and religious ritual, authorship in poetry, philosophy, and historiography, and so on. So the title of Professor Kern's lecture today is Rethinking Authorship in Early China. So let's give a warm applause to Professor Kern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chan, for this very generous introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm really extremely honored to be here today. This is very special for me. As I said last night at dinner, this is really a highlight of my life as a scholar. So thank you for this wonderful invitation. I have my script prepared, not because I cannot speak freely, but if I speak freely, I may too easily go over time. And as my friends always say, you can talk about anything, but not over 45 minutes. So I will try. 而且我当然我也可以用中文讲，可是我听说对某一些人就是英语比普通话还是容易一点，所以我非常对不起你们，我用英语可以吗？So I speak in English. I do not speak a single sentence of Guangdonghua, so sorry. All right, let's go. Rethinking authorship in early China. For the first millennium of Chinese writing after around 1250 BCE, the ancient Chinese did not prize individual authorship. They did not share the Greco-Roman emphasis on named creators that in Pan-Hellenic Greece emerged in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, and extended also to the making, poiesis, of works of painting and sculpture. And this, of course, is where our word poetry comes from. Poetry is the thing that is made. No later than in the 5th century BCE, once a major Greek text became widely known in the Pan-Hellenic world, it carried with it the name of its author, dead or alive, fictional or not. Just think of Homer. Not so in pre-Qin China. What happens here? The thing moves by itself. I didn't touch anything. Oh, you move it. Okay, let me move it. Because I have my numbers written on my script when I want to be on which slide. Thank you. So not so in pre-Qin China. By the 4th century BCE, the curriculum of the 6 arts, the Liu Yi, had developed into a recognized repertoire of writings sustained by practices of teaching, learning, writing, performance, and commentary. Yet none of its texts was firmly attributed to an author. Texts were known, but not under the names of those who made them. Today, I wish to extend a line of thought that begins, that begins with Zhang Xuecheng in his 文史通义 and continues to Yu Jiaxi's 古书通例 and Li Ling's more recent 简博古书与学术源流. These are required readings for any student in early China. As all my students know, they must read them. The literature on authorship fills libraries, of course. This is a big topic in Western literary theory, and in recent years has become voluminous also in early China studies. I could fill the entire lecture by introducing all the writings in sinology in the last 20 years that talk about authorship, but of course, that's not the purpose of today's lecture. I find particularly instructive Jack Stillinger's concept of multiple authorship. There we go. Multiple authorship that he develops in modern English and American literature, interestingly. In his 1991 book, Multiple Authorship and the Myth of Solitary Genius, Stillinger cites the work of an earlier author, Jerome McGann, a critique of modern textual criticism. And here is how he summarizes what McGann had written. So this is Stillinger speaking. McGann wants to promote what he calls a socialized concept of authorship and textual authority, a concept involving not only authors, but publishers, editors, printers, booksellers, purchasers, readers, reviewers, critics, teachers, and students. Literary production is not an autonomous and self-reflective activity. It is a social and an institutional event. The textual authority of a work rests neither with the author nor with his affiliated institution, by which McGann means the publisher. It resides in the actual structure of the agreements with which these two cooperating authorities, and I would add, says Stillinger, the rest of the participants as well, reach in specific cases. Likewise, in early China, authorial agency, an author's production and capacity to shape the subsequent interpretation of what he has written, was not solitary, but a web of intersecting social practices that all contributed to how a text came into being and how it was understood. In fact, this is the only model that holds for pre-imperial China, where, in my view, all authorship was multiple in Stillinger's sense. In his 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, everybody knows that, Roland Barthes notes that to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. Moreover, he says, a text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination, that is, in its interpretation at the hands of readers, interpreters, critics, commentators, and editors. 2 years later, Michel Foucault identified the author then not as the origin of the text, but as a limiting function of its interpretation. The author function, Foucault says, is the principle of thrift in the proliferation of meaning. I love this sentence because it makes so much sense when you think about a text that, if it doesn't have an author, you can read it in so many different ways. And once you put the name on it, you limit the possibilities of interpretation. If I if I quote an early Chinese text and say, this is by Kongzi, it immediately limits what you can understand from this text, as opposed to if I say, oh, this is by Zhuangzi, right? It immediately changes your perspective and sets the boundaries of interpretation. This is what Foucault means. So I agree with Barthes and Foucault, but I think the notion of multiple authorship is even more productive when thinking about early China. And this is one of those moments that happens to me all the time when I think about literary theory and the study of classical Chinese texts. So often when I read, let's say Foucault, or I read Jacobson or other major thinkers in the Western canon of literary theory, I think, if they only had known classical Chinese literature, their theory would be so much better. We have so much to offer to them. Unfortunately, classical Chinese literature is not present in the theoretical canon today. And that's something I feel our field needs to change. This is the job of sinologists, first of all. Now, to begin, most, if not indeed all, Warring States texts of the philosophical masters, the Zhuzi, are anthologies, not works by individual authors, but compilations of diverse materials. Sometimes the result is a relatively coherent book, but often we find collections that are highly disparate in both contents and form of expression. All our received books, named after philosophical masters, underwent more or less complete compilation and organization at the hands of Han and later editors, beginning with the work of Liu Xiang and Liu Xin at the late Western Han Imperial Library. Few, but the most traditionalist scholars, and I don't count myself among them, still think that Xunzi wrote the book Xunzi, that Mengzi wrote the book Mengzi, that Zhuangzi wrote the book Zhuangzi, and so on. Not only is there overwhelming evidence for the composite nature of all these texts, but even in their received versions from the hands of Han and later editors, it is extremely rare to find texts that refer to the author of another text. So when Xunzi refers to human nature, to Mengzi's idea that human nature is good, Xingshan, it does not mean that the person Xunzi has read the book Mengzi. Yeah? He doesn't quote anything from that book. Several masters' texts, Zhuzi, discuss entire series of thinkers for their positions and arguments. You have the Xunzi chapters, you have Zhuangzi, you have Han Feizi. These panoramic discussions of sages and thinkers from high antiquity through the late Warring States period all come from the same time, namely the eve of the Qin unification, or even from the early Han Empire. I think there is general consensus that the Tianjia chapter of Zhuangzi is actually a Han text. Now, this is the time that Mark Edward Lewis has labeled the encyclopedic epoch, when new forms of texts emerged intended to encompass the world in writing. And here I quote from his magnificent 1999 book, Writing and Authority in Early China. These works were part of a general trend proclaiming completeness or totality as the highest form of authority. This dream of writing the world in a single text prefigured, in turn, the enterprise of uniting the world in a single state. The close links in imperial China of political authority with textual mastery or patronage emerged out of this conflation of the intellectual and political realms in a shared ideal of single comprehensive authority. And I think this is a very important point, if I may digress for one moment. The the state. You cannot talk about early Chinese texts without talking about the early Chinese state. And everything changes with the empire. And as an anecdote, I work in several large comparative projects with colleagues from classics and other disciplines. And once I talked to a colleague who is a specialist on Latin literature, and I said, tell me about the role of the state in early Latin literature. And he said, what state? There is no state that does that. It's all private. Yeah? And it couldn't be more different in early China. So the systematic identification of ideas with their authors must be seen in the context of the emerging or newly established imperial state. Mirroring its totalizing impulses as a polity, it lays out an entire intellectual history, diverse and complex. Yet even at this late moment, only thinkers are named, but none of their writings is. And when Sima Tan reflected on the essentials of the 6 philosophical lineages, the Liu Jia Zhiyao in the Shiji, he did not identify a single author. He does not mention a single person. Systematically assigning books to authors had to wait for another century until Liu Xiang and his catalogue of the Imperial Library. For the Warring States, Mark Lewis has described the masters as follows. The text, the master, and the disciples were inextricably bound together. Without the text, there was no master and no disciples, beyond the lives of the individuals involved. Without the master, there was no authoritative text or transmitters of the text. And without the disciples, the text was not written or transmitted, and the master vanished together with his teaching. Unquote. Thus, the masters are not the origin, but the result of the text. And here you begin to hear the echoes of Barthes and Foucault. As historical individuals, these masters had presumably existed, and perhaps even spoke some of the things that are attributed to them. Not all of them, although. My student, Michael Hunter, who teaches at Yale today, wrote a wonderful book on the Kongzi Yue sayings in all early Chinese texts. He found about 4,000 Kongzi Yue sayings, which means that either many of them are not Kongzi Yue, or Kongzi was talking all day long, every day. Think about that. So some of the masters may have said some of the things that are attributed to them. But if they were the speakers of their words, they were not the authors of the texts in which these words are contextualized. The authors instead are unnamed disciples or disciples of disciples or other compilers and editors of the master's words, real or imagined, and the anecdotes in which they appear. No pre-imperial master is on record having claimed to have written his text. As the ancient Greek historians Hecataeus of Miletus, Herodotus, or Thucydides each did at the outset of their books. They each start their books with the very first word is the name. The second word is the place where they come from. Nobody in early China does this. As we see from recently discovered ancient manuscripts, text circulated in a size of short essays, and our transmitted pre-imperial books are anthologies of such shorter, mutually independent writings. In fact, already before the empire, texts were reassembled, reorganized, and retitled. Consider what Sima Qian tells us on 2 works on military strategy. First, King Wei of Qi ordered his ministers to seek out and select from the marshals' methods of war of old, and to add Rangju's to it, and then named it Marshal Rangju's method of war. And then, at the time, the Wei noble science power shook all under heaven. Retainers from the many lords presented their own writings on the methods of war, and the noble sign gave titles to all of them. Thus, in our times, their collection is commonly called the Noble Scion of Ways, Methods of War. So the author named in these two titles that are known to Sima Qian are not the authors in the sense of original first writers. They are collators, selectors, compilers of texts that we can properly call anthologies. In recent decades, hundreds of manuscripts on wood, bamboo, and silk from the last 4 centuries BCE have been recovered, some with counterparts in the received tradition. Many manuscripts carry titles, typically on the back of the first bamboo slip or the last bamboo slip. So when you roll the whole bamboo roll, you can see the title on the outside. But not a single manuscript carries the name of an author, and not a single manuscript refers to the author of any other text. Administrative texts from the early empire sometimes carry signatures of the people who wrote them down. But these are the marks of scribes, not of authors. The scribes who were responsible for the accuracy of texts that were not their own, but that were institutional. And of course, we have enormous amounts of these kinds of texts, especially from Changsha, when you think of the Zhouma-Lo texts or the Wu Guangchang texts and so on. Meanwhile, the philosophical writings that are now found in ancient bamboo manuscripts, there's an echo here, from Guodian or in the looted collections of the Shanghai Museum, Tsinghua University, and other institutions, are without question the result of intellectual choices and responsibilities. Somebody wrote them. But none of these texts identify the author or authors of these choices. So here's a brief summary of the overall situation in early China. Texts in early China were anonymously composed, organized as collaborative projects, or edited, collated, collected, compiled, perfected for purposes of filial piety, of loyalty to a philosophical master, as guidance for a ruler, for ritual events, for commemoration, or to transmit technical and pragmatic knowledge, for example, medical texts. In both writing and orally, texts were composed and recomposed, performed and reperformed as shared communal properties. Their significance lay not in their point of origin, but in their reception, in the way in which how they were used. Thus, in Zhuozhuan, the anonymous Shijing poems were creatively applied in different situations and in the process changed their meaning in response to each situation. With the Chunqiu, older archival records were transformed and encoded with new meaning by Kongzi as their supremely perspicacious editor. Auto-commentary to assist the interpretation of historical narrative was attributed to the nobleman, the Junzi, in Zhuozhuan, and the oral teachings of a philosophical master proliferated over time as they were collected by subsequent generations of disciples. Canonical texts such as the Shijing, the Zhouyi, or the Chunqiu were all semantically underdetermined and attracted multiple lineages of exegesis and transmission that led not only to different commentaries, but to different versions of those texts themselves. In none of these scenarios, text production appears as the solitary composition by a single person. All involved acts of collecting, compiling, editing, complementing, selecting, reducing, commenting, interpreting. The function of authorship was thus distributed across a wide range of agents and activities, almost all of them anonymous. The acts of composing and performing on the one hand, and those of listening, reading, and interpreting on the other, were mutually constitutive and thus instances of multiple authorship. Thus, we must refocus our attention on how texts circulated in early China. And this is precisely what early Chinese thinkers were most concerned about. Think of the dozens of references to Shijing poetry in Zhuozhuan. With 2 or 3 exceptions, they are never about the composition or original meaning of a poem, but only about how the poem is used and made productive under ever new circumstances. No poem was complete in and of itself. In order to attain its meaning in that situation, it needed its performer and interpreter as its second and arguably more important author. Early China is not medieval Europe. Texts were not created just once and then faithfully copied, like in the web of European monasteries and their shared institution of the scriptorium. Instead, after a text was first created, it was repeatedly written anew, and almost always in a new and different form, with a different internal order, with different characters, and often shortened or combined with parts of other texts. This is exactly what we see in recently discovered manuscripts, but not only there. Also in traditional texts, we find numerous instances where songs, arguments, or anecdotes are shared across different texts and are often newly contextualized. How many different versions of the Wu Zixu story do we have? How does the fisherman's song in Sima Qian's Quyuan biography also appear in Mengzi, where it has nothing to do with either Quyuan or a fisherman? In fact, it's a children's song there. So whose song was it after all? Imagine that we find the exact same text in more than one place and contextualize in the same way so that its meaning remains stable across all local instantiations. We would say that such a text was first created or written and thereafter copied or written down. This is a crucial distinction. To write a text is not the same as to write down a text. Such copying or writing down of an existing text, also from memory or dictation, where orality intersects with writing, is secondary to the primary act of textual creation. It leaves the original text untouched. Not so in early China. Instead, texts or parts of texts that are reproduced never seem to remain the same. They're not just rewritten or written down anew, they are reauthored. Thus, in early China, texts existed in vibrant communicated practices that allowed for continuous variation, expansion, recomposition, and borrowing. The transmission of stories, poems, or philosophical arguments was not limited by the boundaries or contextual contents of their first appearance. Textual boundaries themselves were often fluid, with ideas, themes, expressions, poems, stories floating with relative ease, written or oral. In their accumulation, texts existed as ever-evolving instantiation and variations of ideas and expressions. They were by definition composite artifacts. In thinking about such texts, we must therefore consider a multiplicity of textual practices, from composition and recomposition to performance, memorization, circulation, and so on, instead of a series of texts as pristine, original, inviolable things or creations of a single person. Texts before the empire were not things. Manuscripts are things, but texts were not things. They were manifestations of practices involving multiple historical actors. So you can have a text, but the text is not the manuscript. The manuscript is only one physical instantiation of that text. That text can have 100 others, right? So we have to distinguish between the material artifact, the manuscript, that is a thing, and the text that transcends that every individual thing. How should we imagine the making of these composite texts? Did every early Chinese author, compiler, editor work from a large library of physical writings readily at hand? Was every such compiler and editor, first of all, a reader who evaluated his sources and then carefully reconstructed them in new and unique forms? This would certainly be true for imperial scholars like Liu Xiang and Liu Xin, who organized the imperial library and reconstituted its texts in new and definite formats through acts of selection, comparison, and collation. It must also be true for the first big books of early China, the anthology of the Lushi Chunqiu, compiled under the patronage of the merchant and Qin chancellor Lü Buwei, the Huainanzi as a comprehensive philosophical guide to the principles of government under the patronage of Liu An, king of Huainan, or Sima Qian's Shiji. All these were based on existing sources of traditional knowledge. As anthologies of anonymous source materials, their final form was attributed to their patrons or compilers, and rightly so, while not the writers of their source materials, who remained anonymous. Lü Buwei, Liu An, and Sima Qian were authors in the Foucauldian sense of the word. They could be held responsible and they could be punished for their texts. This is one of Foucault's core definition of authorship of a text. If you're the author of a text, in Foucault's sense, you can be punished for that text. Now, let us go one step further. Mere textual materials, like the source materials of Lushi Chunqiu, Huainanzi Shiji, and so on, Zuozhuan, without interpretation, they have writers. Somebody wrote them down. But only works that interpret these materials and give them meaning and collect them in a particular configuration, as these four big books do, only those works have authors and not just writers. And here I draw on my Princeton colleague, Alexander Nehamas, in his critique of Foucault. According to Nehamas, Foucault conflates text with work and writer with author. All texts have writers or oral creators, but only a text open to interpretation is a work and has as such the construct of the author manifested within it. Both Lushi Chunqiu and Huainanzi are works with authors, and the authors are not the writers, because their individual chapters derive their meaning from being parts of a whole, which in both cases is pregnant with purpose. Even more interesting is the case of Sima Qian and the Shiji, a work that is both compiled and written. Legions of scholars since Northern Song times have hailed Sima Qian as both a thinker and a literary stylist, even though most of the Shiji was not newly written by Sima Qian or his father Sima Tan, or later contributors like Zhu Shaosun. But it was merely compiled, and often very poorly so. The compilatory nature of the Shiji is obvious from the analytic chapters on ancient kings and early emperors. It's also obvious in the historiographic tables, the biao, of rulers, ministers, officials, military men, and so on. And it is obvious in the monographs, the shu, on technical subjects. But it is also true for Sima Qian's only genuine invention, namely the biographical chapters, the liezhuan, that focus on individuals, groups of people, or certain regions and their people. Many of these biographies are badly stitched patchworks from diverse sources. Just think of the biographies of Kongzi, of Laozi, of Qu Yuan. Try to read any of them as a coherent narrative. You will fail, and this is not your failure, that's the failure of the text. It is not a continuous narrative. It's a compilation of things. Here, an interesting gap opens between authorship and authenticity. Because these chapters are so poorly integrated, self-contradictory, and discontinuous patchworks, because they are so imperfect, they are considered authentic, namely unmanipulated by an ordering hand. Incoherent and stylistically defective, they seem true precisely because they are transparently compiled, not authored. In them, we see the mere materials that precede their combination into works. What turns them into the works, presumably of the author, quote-unquote, Sima Qian, is how these disparate materials are compiled toward a unified meaning. The author of the whole is not the writer of its parts, but their first reader and interpreter. The same must be said of the only historical figure who in Warring States times is called an author of a major text, Kongzi for the Chunqiu. According to the Mengzi, when the world declined and the way fell into obscurity, heresies and violence arose. There were instances of regicides and patricides. Confucius was apprehensive and created the springs and autumns. The springs and autumns concern the business of the Son of Heaven. Because of this, Confucius said, those who understand me will do so for the spring and autumns. Those who find me guilty of crimes will do so for the springs and autumns. And shortly thereafter, Mencius concludes, after Confucius had completed the springs and autumns, rebellious ministers and murderous sons lived in fear. Now, the authenticity of these passages is uncertain, and the claim advanced here has been disputed. To some, such as the great scholar Yang Bojun, our principal commentator of Zhuozhuan, Confucius had nothing to do with the text at all. Yet since Han times, others saw him to be indeed the principal author of the Chunqiu that had endowed the text with meaning and significance. That is, who had transformed the scribal materials into a work in the sense of Nehemas. If originally the Annals was the product of the anonymous court archivists in Lu, it was the sage who then fashioned, did, organized, arranged in sequence, transmitted, brought to completion, or perfected the text. All verbs used for what Confucius did. All of these words appear in Han sources. Nobody, however, and presumably not even the author of the Mengzi, claims that Confucius actually created Zuo, the Annals, from scratch. And nobody ever used the word to write, zhu or shu, the only word that means to write, for what Confucius did. Instead, he raised zuo, and this is the word that's used in Mengzi. He raised the Annals to a new significance through his editing, where he deployed subtle phrases to convey great principles, the wei and dai. The word zuo does not only mean to create. If you look it up in the Shou and Jie, you find that the first meaning is qi, to raise, to stand up. Kongzi zuos in the Luanyu, which means he stands up. So this is the meaning, I think, that is used here. In other words, Kongzi interpreted, recreated, and therefore transformed the textual materials of the earlier scribes into a work by encoding it with significance and purpose. This new author was then the principal author, and the text, now his work, replacing the earlier anonymous archivists who remain invisible and without any agency at all. None of the Lu scribes has a name. Moreover, as my friend Guo Xian at Fudan University has noted, this second creation transformed not only the text, it also transformed Kongzi into a sage, sanctifying both text and author. 3 times in Sima Qian's Shiji, one finds that Kongzi, quote, relied on the records of the archivists to create the Springs and Autumns Annals, or relied on the text of the archivists to arrange in sequence the Springs and Autumns Annals. No other name from the writers of the original materials is attributed to the annals. Remarkably, Confucius is not said to have added anything to the annals. To the contrary, he reduced them. He abbreviated the pattern phrasing while signifying broadly. He arranged the records of the archivists and oral accounts of old knowledge. He abbreviated the pattern phrases. He removed the superfluous duplicates. He left to oral instruction what was not permissible to be made manifest in writing. This comes all from Shiji and other texts of the time. This model of recomposition as textual reduction was later followed by others who, according to Sima Qian's Shiji, continued to abbreviate the historical accounts. So likewise, Duo Jiao, tutor to King Wei of Chu, this is all according to Shiji, believing that the king could not handle the entire texts of Zhuozhuan, selectively chose accounts of success and failure to create his own version of the text. And by the way, these texts often refer to Chunqiu, but when they say Chunqiu, what they mean is Zhuozhuan. This is a very common use in Western Han. So this is all about Zhuozhuan. In the same vein, the statesman Excellency Yu Qing selected from the Springs and Autumns. Will it stop? This is the fire alarm, I figure. Okay. Nothing is on fire yet. So Yu Qing selected from the Springs and Autumns to create his Yu Shi Chunqiu. And when Lü Buwei compiled the Lü Shi Chunqiu, he also cut and chose from Zhuozhuan. Similarly, Sima Qian tells us the various masters, Xunzi, Mengzi, Gongsonggu, Han Fei, and the like, all frequently selected material from Zhuozhuan for their writings, more often than can be counted, he says. All these accounts present authorship as compiling, editing, reducing. They all deploy the same vocabulary of selecting, cutting, choosing, removing, that is, textual reduction and refinement. The result is never seen as a lesser text. Instead, it is seen as an improved text. Confucius himself is said once again in the Shiji to have compiled the 305 poems of the classic of poetry, the Shijing, by selecting them from a corpus of more than 3,000. Yes. He removed duplicates and selected those pieces that could be applied to the principles of ritual. It is not clear what is meant by duplicates, but these cannot have been just multiple physical bamboo texts of exactly the same content. Instead, as we now find repeatedly in early discovered manuscripts, they would have been a range of different versions drawn from the same textual repertoires. As discussed 70 years ago, whoa, I will wait. So to come back and to pick up the last train of thought, so I repeat the previous sentence. When Kongzi removes the duplicates, right? We don't really know what duplicates means, but these cannot have been just multiple physical bamboo texts that are all saying exactly the same thing. Instead, as we now find repeatedly in newly discovered manuscripts, they would have been a range of different versions drawn from the same overall textual repertoires. So these duplicates were things that were very similar to each other, but were not identical. As discussed by Piet van der Loon 73 years ago in Tongbao, and Paul Goldin much more recently, Han Dynasty imperial editors like Liu Xiang followed the same logic and practice when routinely reducing major pre-imperial works such as the Xunzi Guanzi or Yanshi Chunqiu, each time by 90%, which is also what Kongzi did with the 3,000 songs to 300. Somehow throwing away 90% seems to be the way to go. So the Annals before Confucius, a text to which we have no access, was probably nothing more than a list of bare analytic entries so extremely terse and esoteric as to be entirely incomprehensible to those who did not have access to their contexts. If you ever tried to read the Chunqiu, you know what I mean. It's very hard to understand what it is about. Yet the Annals did not end with Confucius. It was only the Gongyang Zhuan commentary that explained both the Annals and Confucius' role in transforming them from text to work, and by encoding the text with his great principles, the Dai, and historical judgment. Thus, the Gongyang commentary contains one passage where Confucius is quoted as identifying himself as the author. In the 12th year of Luo Zhao, in the spring, Gao Yan of Qi led an army and brought to power the northern Yan Earl at Yang. What is meant by Earl at Yang? This is typical Gongyang inquiry. It is Prince Yang. The master said, I already knew this miswriting of a personal name as a location. Someone bystanding said, if you knew this, why did you not change it? And then Kongzi responds, what about those other instances where one does not know that something is wrong? The Springs and Autumns is so faithful to history that its sequence of lords is the one established by Lord Huan of Qi and Lord Wen of Jin. And its accounts of assemblies match how they were arranged by the hosts. However, as for its phrasing, I, Qiu, must bear the blame alone. In this scenario, Confucius is both the secondary and the principal author. He is less than a true author in the sense of original creator. The text already precedes him. And yet he is an author in the fullest sense, as he impregnates the Annals with his personal judgments, according to both Mencius and the Gongyang commentary. He takes responsibility for the text and is willing to be condemned and punished for it. He is the author not because he created the text, but because he transformed it. He now can be known by the text and can be held responsible for it. So to return once again to Barthes, as already cited earlier, the text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. In the case of the Annals, this destination is not just any anonymous reader. It's certainly not any of us. It is not with Plato's Phaedrus, a discourse that, because it is written, roams about everywhere, reaching indiscriminately those with understanding no less than those who have no business with it. And it doesn't know to whom it should speak and to whom it should not. This is Plato's critique of writing. Instead, it is meant strictly for those reader commentators who would come to reveal the work of the earlier reader editor Confucius. First among them, the authors of the Gongyang commentary, whose extremely rigorous catechistic exegesis of the annals then set out to decode what Confucius had, according to them, encoded in the first place. So the Gongyang scholars, too, must be regarded as co-authors of the annals. If Kongzi had transformed an obscure and esoteric annalistic record into a work of deep significance and judgment, then the Gongyang authors turned Kongzi's esoteric judgments into exoteric ones, now laid open for all to see and understand. The Chunqiu needed the Gongyang in order to be understandable. And following the Gongyang editors came the subsequent commentators, first in the Han Dynasty, from Dong Zhongshu to Huang Quan and He Xiu, then in the Tang with the sub-commentary of the Wujing Zhengyi, led by Kong Yingda, and so forth. Starting with Confucius, all these were readers, commentators, editors, and ultimately co-authors of a classic that, due to their efforts in Italo Calvino's work, had never finished saying what it has to say. Such various forms of distributed authorship remain highly ambiguous, with no clear distinction between composition, performance, and the interventions of commentators and editors. Their roles as transmitters, interpreters, or performers were united in the quest for the perfection of the text. Due to their efforts, there is the work. Before them, there was only textual material. So to summarize, traditionally, we call one person the author while thinking of those who come later as contributors, editors, or commentators. We imagine a hierarchy where the latter roles seem to merely follow from and build upon the former one. This presumed hierarchy of what is original and what is secondary, however, is problematic. In early China, more often than not, this hierarchy of significance and of signification is reversed. What unites those in one way or another exerted their agency over a pre-existing work is a fundamental quest, not for the creation, but for the perfection or transformation of the text as a new original that replaces the first one. Their activity was only seemingly of a secondary nature. Accordingly, we usually do not know the names of those who created the original, yet still imperfect or incomplete texts. Instead, we know the names of those who perfected, interpreted, or presented them, and whose engagement resulted then in these new originals. Not only do we thus recognize a plurality of original moments of textual creation. In addition, while procedures such as compiling or reorganizing were performed on pre-existing materials and often post-dated those materials by decades and centuries, the agency, power, and control that the later editors and compilers held over the text far exceeded that of the original writer. Consider the philosophical master's text as noted above. We can certainly assume that the masters, as historical individuals, did teach their ideas with authority and were revered for that. But they did not create their eponymous texts. That role fell to subsequent generations, who constructed and staged the earlier masters as the authors of their ideas. Frequently, through processes of accretion and the circulation of parallel but not identical versions, the material associated with the master would first grow considerably before it was once again shrunk by a later editor, for example, a librarian, who set out to finally delimit the corpus and turn it into a book. Both the adding of new materials and their subsequent reduction were not just editorial, but authorial acts, that is, successive acts of multiple authorship because they radically transformed and literally rewrote the existing material and organized it into a new form that had never existed before and was now subject to a new and different interpretation. Every change in the reorganization of a text, which is amply attested for so many texts, such as with Liu Xiang and Yang Liang for the Xunzi, Guo Xiang for Zhuangzi, Wang Yi and Hong Xinzu for Zhuzi, and so on, always profoundly influenced how the text was read and understood. It changed the meaning of the text. When Confucius famously stated, 出而不作, I transmit but do not create, he seems to have expressed himself with modesty, since only a sage, a shengren, was supposed to be able to truly create, 做. And yet we would be wrong in understanding Kongzi as being only modest. Instead, 说不做 also points to the genuine significance of reception, transmission, interpretation, transformation. If we are accustomed to think of the original text as primary and its subsequent editing as secondary, early Chinese practices prompt us to reverse this relationship. The commonplace that the commentary makes the canon, that a canonical text only becomes canonical by way of its commentary, is vividly on display in early China. Not surprisingly, even the phrase 书而不作, mostly associated with Confucius, was itself, in one form or another, a commonly used formula that may not have originated with Kongzi at all. In a world where original claims to authorship were virtually absent, claims to editorship, compilation, and commentary were the more important, consequential, and authoritative actions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kern, for the wonderful lecture. So let's go to the round table.
Seems we're running a little late.
Thank you, Professor Chen and Professor Kern. Please take a seat, and we will now start our Q&A section. So for participants in Zoom, please feel free to type your questions there. And for participants here, you're very much welcome to use your mic in front of you or next to your seat, as you can find on your seat. You can press the button and you can feel free to raise your questions.
The questions can be raised in either English or Mandarin. 也可以讲国语，就是提问也可以用英文。Professor Ho.
Thank you very much, Professor Kern. Very inspiring talk, which can solve many problems we come across in the studies of ancient Chinese texts. Under your theories, I will think some problems about the authorship of some ancient Chinese texts. For instance, as you have just mentioned, the Xunji. There are more than 300 chapters before Liu Shang's cutting the overlaps. Now we have about 32 chapters. Yes, only 3 chapters supposed to be written by his disciple, because in the chapters, the author or the writer mentions that his teacher's name, Xun Xin Ji Yue. Right. So we confirmed that 3 chapters, in fact, are written by Xunji's disciples instead of Xunji himself. And for the another example you just mentioned about the Renyu, the Confucius, there are totally 20 chapters nowadays in this book. What we believed is the last 5 chapters, in fact, are written by Confucius' disciples. But according to your theory nowadays, there are much more chapters or paragraph or content, in fact, are written by Xunji or Confucius' disciples or disciples of disciples. So any methodology you could suggest to us to identify or distinguish the content by the author himself or the followers?
That's a very important question. Can you all hear me? Is this microphone loud enough? Am I close enough? Yeah. That's, of course, a very important question. If we think about what we normally do when we look for an author in the text, what are we actually looking for? We're looking for a historical person, and we're trying to know something about that person's ideas, emotions, and so on. And then from there, we try to interpret the text. This is called, in literary theory, the biographical fallacy. First, we use the textual materials to reconstruct the biography of the person, as with Kongzi. And then we use that biography to understand the materials. That is beautifully circular. And that is the biographical fallacy. We cannot do that. We cannot take that as our starting point because it just doesn't work. The question is, which texts can we think of where we really think one person wrote a significant part? I think we can, Paul Goldin always tells me, try Sun Tzu, Sun Tzu Bingfa, and try Han Feizi. Okay. And try 3 or 4 chapters of Xunzi, which are very coherent in their ideas. But I'm not so sure, because when I read Xunzi, for example, I once wrote an essay on the first chapter of Xunzi, Quanque. If you read Quanque, you very carefully, and you do it with textual analysis, so you don't start out from a completely, I don't want to say invented, but imagined biography of Xunzi, who apparently lived for more than 100 years. If you don't start from there, you can only start from the text itself. If you start from the text itself, you realize that even a chapter like Quanque is very discontinuous. It is not a consistent line of thought. If you take a chapter like Zhengming, or yeah, it's a good example. It starts with its topic. You get to about 1/3 of the text, less than half, the topic completely disappears. The second half of the chapter is not about that topic at all. Now, you have 2 options. You can say, well, Xunzi was kind of reasonably coherent when he got up in the morning, had a cup of tea, wrote the first half, then he took a nap, and then became completely incoherent and wrote the second half. If that is a good idea to interpret texts, then we can do that. I would suggest we don't. I would suggest these discontinuities, these ruptures, these incoherences in the texts, at first they look like problems. How do we solve this problem? Why are there so many contradictions in Xunzi, also between chapters? There's always a problem. No, it's not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to rethink how these texts came into being. It's only a problem as long as we insist that they must come from the same person. If we let go of that idea, then it's not a problem at all, but an opportunity to think of all the other possibilities. And that's what we do. That's how I would go about it. And there's another methodology, of course. You can look at, for example, you can do now very easily a linguistic analysis, computer aided, including by your wonderful database, the Chan database, right? So I take the entire Xunzi and from Chan, I plug it into the ctext.org website, because I don't trust their text, I trust your text. And I trust the text from Academia Sinica. And then I run a tool of textual comparison. And you know what I find? In fact, not I have found it, but my student, Liu Meihui, has found this. She wrote a wonderful seminar paper on this. Which one is the most famous chapter of Xunzi? For all of you. If you have ever read anything from Xunzi, what have you read? You have read Xing'e. Everybody knows Xing'e. Everybody thinks Xing'e, that's the core position of Xunzi, because that's the position for which he was kicked out of the Confucian temple and so on and so on. Well, guess what? if you do a comparison tool of vocabulary and syntax, you realize that Xing'e is one of 2 or 3 chapters that have absolutely no connection with anything else in Xunzi, that are completely outside of it. And many people have observed that. Now we can use computerized methods to actually show it and visualize it. And I would say the person who wrote Xing'e was probably not the person who wrote the core chapters of the rest of Xunzi. So we have these options. Does that make sense?
Try to search the items to be used in one chapter.
For example,
yeah.
But we can also, instead of, I mean, that's not enough. That's just the beginning. We can do a computer analysis, but that can only be the beginning, because then we have to look at the data and we have to interpret the data. But what I always do is I start by reading the text very carefully without the desire to make everything work.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a question from online. Yeah, this is Frank Chong from the philosophy department. He asks, I would like to ask about the concepts of classics, Jing, and commentary, Zhuan. Once a work is regarded as a classic, does it mean that it can't be edited but must be faithfully transmitted? If so, how should we understand the concept of classic using your framework? Thank you.
It's a very good question. The first thing when we think about Jing is, why do we call it a classic? Is that the right word? Or should we call it a canon, which is a very different word? A canon is a word that has quasi-legal status. A classic, Homer is a classic. The Bible is not a classic. The Bible is a canon. Yeah, there's a fundamental distinction. And my colleague and friend Guo Xian at Fudan, whom I cited earlier, has written a wonderful essay on this question, whether we should use classic at all for early Chinese texts. And you know, in English, we have other possibilities. We can say scripture, for example. Right? The problem with Jing and Zhuan is that we think we know the sequence. First is Jing, and then is Zhuan. I don't think that is entirely correct. I think there is material that is considered authoritative, that is agreed upon as important, as even canonical. This is what we all must know. But once the commentary comes in, and the different commentators come in, as they tend to do in early China, the Jing changes. The Jing is not stable. The Chunqiu Jing is not the same in Zhuan as in Gongyang and Guliu. The Shi Jing, the core text, is not the same in the Mao Shi, the Qi Shi, the Lu Shi, the Han Shi. Because the text itself gets adapted to its interpretation. And therefore, we must rethink the hierarchy and the authority and the temporal sequence of Jing and Zhuan. In fact, on Saturday, when I talk about the Shi Jing in manuscripts, I can show you that. Interpretation precedes writing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kern, for a very stimulating talk. You have, I think that this is one of the classic lectures that I think people will that will find many destinations in the future, as you have put it. I think that your lecture has raised two distinct and important topics for us here. One concerns our treatment of classical Chinese text, and the second one being the theoretical issue of authorship. Now, not being a scholar in early Chinese text, I have no contribution, or I have no questions about your interpretations on the Gongyang and Sun Tzu and all these people. But I am very curious to learn more about your interpretation of this idea of authorship. I think you have very persuasively explained to us that there are multiple authors for many of these canonical texts. However, I am not entirely ready to to think that these texts that your argument would amounts to this final point of the subversion of the hierarchy of these texts, because after all these writers of these texts, or the compilers, they are dead. They cannot argue with you. Right. So if we were to use your point and to try to apply that notion of multiple authorship to say in the 20th century, then I cannot help but to ask, like, would that concept also holds true? For instance, if I give a very ignorant example of, say, Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee has said many things. He's a philosopher. And of course, for those who study philosophy, they would say, oh, no, Bruce Lee just got that quote from so-and-so and all these people. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody would have problem accepting that whatever Bruce Lee has said would be a very Bruce Lee thing. He said be water or whatever. We will always associate those words that he uttered to be, oh, that is very Bruce Lee.
Yes.
So in other words, doesn't matter. I mean, so I think what your point is, you are taking a very literal argument about the word authorship. But if we were to broaden that definition of authorship to be something that is more accommodating, then we wouldn't have a problem here, right?
Sure. One of the terms I use is distributed authorship. We do have, of course, the people who create ideas, and then we have the people who do something with these ideas. I was just thinking, as you spoke, I was thinking of two examples, one from China, one from England. There are famous poems by Li Bai that have typically one or two signature lines that everybody knows, everybody quotes, and says, only Li Bai can say something like this, right? Then you have that poem suddenly in Dunhuang without being attributed to Li Bai and without that line. But the rest of the poem is there. What do we do with it? I don't know. I don't know if this means this poem has nothing to do with Li Bai, or somebody plugged something in that is very Li Bai, or, well, many other possibilities. The second example is I found in an essay by a Shakespeare scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, Peter Stallybrass, a fantastic scholar of texts. About 15 years ago, he published an essay with the title Against Thinking. And at that time, our databases were just beginning to be compiled. We didn't have AI, but we had our first databases. And so he could search the entire corpus of English literature from the time of Shakespeare and before. And he searched it for the signature lines from Shakespeare, the sleep of death, to be or not to be, and so on and so on. So he gives you one after another. And for one line after another, where we say only Shakespeare can say this, he gives you 3 or 4 examples where this line appears a generation before Shakespeare or at the same time of Shakespeare, and so on. Yeah. So what that means really is, it doesn't really demote Shakespeare. It contextualizes Shakespeare. It makes it clear that Shakespeare worked not as a solitary genius, to use Stillinger's phrase, but worked in an existing context of ideas and expressions, and participated in that and contributed to that. And ultimately did something with these phrases that nobody else had done before. So even if these phrases were in earlier works, they don't have the same power there. Yeah. So Shakespeare is, in that sense, the author of that text, but he is also then the last in that line. After Shakespeare has done it, nobody else can use the line ever again, because it's fixed now with the name Shakespeare. Yeah. So I don't want to throw out the whole idea of authorship. To the contrary, what I would like to emphasize is whether you look at contemporary material, certainly go on the internet, or whether you look at European materials or ancient Chinese materials, the idea of the single author is a very problematic idea that creates more problems than it actually solves. It helps us in the Foucauldian sense to put a single reading on a text. But that comes at very high opportunity costs, because once you do that, you exclude all other possible readings. And so if we try to leave that author figure aside for a moment, the text opens up with many more possibilities and many more relationships to other texts. That's what I would like to advocate. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe not fully.
Thank you. There's another question online. Actually, the topic is close to our discussions. He asks, was Sima Qian a composite author? Also,
Oh,
yeah.
I talk about this the day after tomorrow.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, Sima Qian is so difficult. What do we know about Sima Qian? What do we really know about Sima Qian? And where does that knowledge come from? As far as I know, everything we know about Sima Qian comes from texts that are attributed to Sima Qian himself, whether or not he wrote them. The 2 main sources are the Taishi Gong Zixu, the last chapter of the Shiji, and the letter to Ren'an that first appears in Ban Gu's biography of Sima Qian in Nanzhou. And there's overlap between these 2 sources. There is an ongoing debate that will never end, as far as I can tell, whether Sima Qian wrote the letter. But again, the question that I'm interested in is not whether or not he wrote the letter, because we cannot know. There is no conclusion to that. But what does it mean for our reading of the Shiji and for our understanding of how the person, the historical Sima Qian, is present within the Shiji and shapes the Shiji? How is that influenced if we say he wrote the letter or he did not write the letter? It's a question of interpretation. We do not have access to the historical Sima Qian. Even if everything that is attributed to Sima Qian was written by him, it is still a representation of the historical figure of Sima Qian as the author of the Shiji. We must distinguish between a historical person and the voice of the text. That's not the same thing. And so in some way, Sima Qian is a very composite, I don't even know what to say, persona or thing or phenomenon. But it's a rhetorical construction in the way it appears. And I think I want to show that on Friday. Turn on the mic. Yes.
Sorry. So it's so delightful to see you revisiting this extremely important topic. And also we see so many insightful new ideas keep developing over years. And today I want to revisit a quote that you really love from Michel Foucault.
Yes.
Right? Also function is a principle of thrift in the proliferation of meaning.
Yes.
I love that quote and I quote that as well. But today I'm also thinking about another aspect, maybe the upside of that meaning. Because sometimes by building on the agreement that author is a property, a function, but still when a text is imposed with an author or inscribed into it, it not merely just kills some sporadically distributed possible potential meaning, but also it can generate a meaning that is otherwise impossible. And in this sense, it's not a principle of thrift, but also a principle, a sign of proliferation as well, because it intensifies the text. And also it gives rise to some intellectual engagement, sometimes very seriously, with the text that is otherwise not there. Imagine the Trentio, if without Confucius as an author, it would never generate so tremendously developed interpretation and give rise to the new text. In that sense, it's exactly the proliferation of new meaning. But without that sagely authorship, nobody will ever read it in that way. So I'm thinking about if we think in this way, then maybe we are building up a mutually complementary reading or understanding of author as a concept, because it is double oriented towards thrift or proliferation at once.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, can we use that to maybe enrich or elaborate the concept author or something alike? Paradigm?
Yes. I very much think so. And you and I have been talking about these things for almost a decade.
Yeah.
Let's take the example of Sima Qian, because we just talked about it. What if there was no Sima Qian associated with the Shiji? What do we do with the Shiji, right? Now, the interesting thing is, as Esther Klein has shown, our reading of the Shiji through the lens of the Sima Qian biography, through his pain, through his suffering, and so on, which is expressed in the letter and in the Taishigong Zixu. That reading only became important in the Song dynasty. This is a wonderful book that Professor Klein has written. What is the exact title? Do you remember it?
I don't remember.
Reading Sima Qian from Han to Song or something like this. You will find it if you search for it. She shows us very clearly that that in the Han, you start with people like Yang Xiong, Wang Chong, and then you go through the 6 dynasties, and then you go into the Tang. People were reading the Shiji without thinking, who is this person? Right? It didn't really matter. Bangu criticizes the Shiji because he says there's too much fanciful stuff and crazy stuff in there. But he doesn't talk really about, oh, and Sima Qian, here is how he suffered. Even though Bangu wrote that or put together that biography, which is largely based on the letter itself. Then comes the Song, and especially in the Northern Song, and this is directly related to the Guwen Yundong. In the Guwen Yundong, the idea of the author becomes extremely important because it's a moral idea. Yeah, it starts already in the Tang with Liu Zongyuan and Han Yu, and then it becomes a moral idea. Northern Song thinkers then discover Sima Qian as a voice in the text, and that generates a whole different reading of the Shiji. You could also say it generates a new Shiji. Yeah, because the text no longer means what it meant before. It means more things, proliferation.
Proliferation of meaning.
But it is not a proliferation of meaning in a directionless sense. And I think this is what Foucault was trying to emphasize. I think he was emphasizing, if you take that away, the interpretations are not only many, but they can randomly go in all directions. If you have the Sima Qian figure in the Northern Song, you get more of that interpretation, but it only goes in that direction. It's not random anymore. And therefore, even though it generates new meaning, it does that within a more or less defined channel. And therefore, the principle of thrift still applies, even in the proliferation.
Yeah, I think that's a beautifully answered. And it point out that they are mutually complementary to orientations
totally.
That we can consider at once. Thank you so much.
There's a question up there.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your lecture. And I would like to ask, can Han scholars still obtain the content of the Shi Jing manuscripts in some kind of form? As Ban Gu, who studied Qi Shi, mentioned that the complete manuscripts or the texts of Shi Jing have been lost in the beginning of Han Dynasty. And the texts at that time were composed of the sections owned by different scholars. None of the 3 commentaries represent the original meaning of the Shi Jing. However, he also said that the Lu commentary was closed under the circumstance. How did they compare the Han scholars' commentaries with the thought of the author or writer in pre-Han period, or thinking about the authorship in the pre-Han period where the texts are lost and only have the content passed down by orally? Thank you.
That's a very complex question because it has so many multiple layers to it. First of all, you have to believe the story of Fenshu Kangwu that the Shi Jing as a text was lost under the Qin. I don't believe that. The 5 classics at the Qin imperial court, if we read the sources closely, they were destroyed, if they were destroyed, in the versions that circulated outside of the imperial court, which means they were monopolized at the court and canonized at the court. But maybe when Xiangyu burned down the Qin library, some tragic loss happened. When we look at textual variants in Shijing manuscripts in the Han, in the early Western Han, Ma Wangdui, for example, or Fuyang, and compare them with textual variants before the Han, there is not much of a difference. So the first question is, we don't really know what happened. The second question is, what did the so-called Sanja do with the Shi? We know that they had different readings and that these different readings created different texts. We also know that together with the Mao Shi, the one thing that they seem to share is that they try to historicize the poems. And this is what Bangu is concerned with. Because one thing that authorship does is it allows you to date the text. A text itself is hard to date, but if you say, this is by this person, and you can say, and I can tell you when that person lived, you can say, okay, so this text comes from that century, and the other text from that other person comes either earlier or later. Yeah. So the Imperial Library Catalog that Liu Xiang and Liu Xin put together is not just a library catalog, it's an intellectual history of texts. It historicizes the text in sequence. This is what Bangu worries about. The problem is that before the empire, you do not have any discussions of authorship of Shijing poetry. I mean, very little, tiny bits. I can think of 2 or 3 passages altogether. But it's not a theme. It becomes a theme only with the Han commentators, who then disagree on everything. Whether Guanju is a praise poem of praising King Wen and his wife, or whether it is a poem of criticizing King Kang and his lover 100 years later. We have no access to where these stories come from. And I think Bangu didn't have access to that either. And so I'm not sure to which extent his worries are about individuals involved. Because when we read the Sanja that you mentioned, they very rarely name individual authors for the poems. They say the Guoren of the state of so-and-so. That's all you get. You get this collective designation, which locates the text in time, but doesn't locate it in specific people and their specific biographies. Guoren is not specific personalities, but is an institution. And that's all what Bangu had to think about.
It's now 1:04, and the 4 minutes can fully compensate the time wasted by the fire alarm. So I think it's time to end our lecture today. And the talk is wonderful, and the discussions are very fruitful. And we are looking forward to next lecture on the coming Friday. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kern and Professor Chan, for this inspiring lecture. And thank you all again for coming. So Professor Kern would be delivering 2 more lectures on Friday in Chinese University of Hong Kong and Saturday at the Hong Kong Central Library. So please feel free to come again. You can find the details of the lecture in the booklet. And lastly, please help us to fill out the questionnaire by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks.